Imagine yourself, in the dead of winter, stepping onto the icy floor of an upscale bakery, and right in front of you, a skinny boy, barefoot and wide-eyed with fear, takes the risk of stealing a stale loaf of bread forgotten on the counter. The owner panics. The millionaire Eduardo, irritated, nearly calls the police. But then he notices that hungry look, the look that somehow stirs up memories he's tried to bury since childhood. What could have driven this child to such desperation? Curious, and with his heart pounding, Eduardo decides to follow the boy through the city's hectic streets. But nothing he expects prepares him for what he sees at the end of the alley. Lucas is not alone. Two younger siblings, little and dirty, both shivering and hungry, wait anxiously for the stolen piece of bread. Now what? Will Eduardo just turn away and go on with his life? Or will this encounter change the fate of these children and his own? Stay with me, because what happens next will move you. Eduardo's breathing was tight from the moment he woke up. The black car outside had barely cooled off when he opened the bakery door, the most famous place in the neighborhood, French name, glass counters gleaming, quiet background music only for those born into money. The watch on his wrist ticked faster and faster, hardly any time to spare. The morning felt even colder than usual, one of those days when the city barely wakes up, fog clinging to the rooftops. He walked in, and everyone glanced up, even the barista straightening his apron, smiling at the sharp suit. But Eduardo was focused only on his extra-strong coffee, hoping it would warm at least his body, since his mind was another story. He had an important meeting soon, numbers running through his brain like a hive of bees, and just wanted to stick to the plan. But there at the counter, almost hidden behind a pyramid of overpriced baguettes, was someone nobody noticed, a scrawny, dirty little boy with hair stuck down by rain and grime. Couldn't have been older than 7. His eyes were huge, brown so dark Eduardo felt like he could see into them. He stared at the bread like a starving animal, thirsty but quiet, as if practicing how to disappear. Eduardo placed his order out of force of habit, hardly noticing, until he saw the boy, quick as a bird, step sideways and press his belly against the most secluded table, sliding one small hand behind the basket of old bread. The boy glanced around, felt someone watching, froze for a second. In the strange silence of the bakery, you could only hear the coffee machine bubbling and some random French song. The boy grabbed a day-old loaf, the kind nobody wants, and shoved it inside his threadbare sweater. He moved so fast it was like his hand never existed. But that instant stayed frozen. Because Eduardo saw, and the kid saw he'd been seen. Between them, only the sound of their breathing, the outside world drowned out by the fogged-up glass. For a split second, Eduardo felt his blood boil. He thought of the loss, the outrage, a boy stealing bread, right here, where everything cost so much. He gripped his briefcase strap. Instinct said to intervene, complain, call someone. But the boy's gaze, frozen and frightened, held no anger and no cunning. Only hunger and crippling fear. The boy's cheeks were chilled, nearly blue, and his hand shook as he clutched the bread to his chest. No one else noticed. The well-dressed customers, low voices and fancy hats, were too occupied with their phones or taking photos of expensive croissants. Only Eduardo and the boy. And for a moment, it felt like only the two of them existed in that place. The boy stared straight into Eduardo's eyes. And in those eyes, there was no defiance, only a silent plea. A desperate message without words. Let me go. The smell of fresh bread didn't make sense anymore. Time hung between them. The boy lifted his foot from the floor, and then Eduardo saw he was barefoot. The cold marble kicked at his feet, the big toe already dirty from dried, cracked blood. Then, making almost no sound, the boy turned away from everyone and headed for the door. His sweater rode up a little, ribs showing. He looked like a sick bird trying to fly. He held onto the bread as if it was treasure, something he couldn't afford to lose. The way he looked around, with a silent apology, desperate to vanish, said it all without a word. The bakery's heavy door thudded as he pushed it open. Only then did the people notice. One or two looked over with disapproval, a quiet murmur, but soon returned to their important conversations, ignoring the biting chill that rushed in after the boy. Eduardo stood still. His coffee was ready on the counter, steaming into the expensive cup. But the scent was different now, the scent of that forgotten childhood, the hunger he'd once known when he was just Maria's boy, scraping the last bits of rice from the pan. But he couldn't move. He felt a weight on his chest. Was it anger? Pity? Or just the urge to secretly cry, the kind of thing old men pretend not to feel? The silence grew heavy, as if the city was waiting for something to happen. Outside, the wind sent leaves skittering across the wet sidewalk. No one noticed the boy sprinting down the street, clutching the stolen bread to his chest. Eduardo followed the fragile shadow with his eyes, feeling a knot inside that defied description. He couldn't stop thinking, why this boy? Why now? And why, even after having it all, did that old pain never go away? The watch bit into his wrist. People rushed in and out. In his mind, the boy's frightened face, those huge eyes, kept replaying, like a movie stuck on its most tender scene. All that was left was the sound of the wind outside, and a cold that not even the world's most expensive coffee could warm. Eduardo stood there, coffee cup still trembling in his hand. He couldn't get that scene out of his head, the boy shoving the bread inside his sweater, the way he looked at him, bracing for the worst. He wanted to just turn his back. Just another city story, he thought. Not my problem, he even muttered, trying to push the image aside the same way he did with so many other daily discomforts. But the more he tried, the more the boy's eyes haunted him. It wasn't just hunger or fear. There was shame too, an old ache nobody could ever quite explain. The bakery noise carried on. Coffee machine hissing, quiet chatter, a woman complaining about her change. The world moved along as if nothing had happened. But inside him, something had. Something pressed tight in his chest, a blend of anger and sorrow. Anger for having witnessed it, for feeling that helpless sting. Anger at himself, too, for being so unsettled by something so small. He was a businessman. He shouldn't. He couldn't. But he couldn't leave. The bakery door swung shut, still trembling from the boy's rushed escape. Without even realizing, Eduardo left his coffee on the counter. The scent of fresh bread now antagonized him. What difference does one less loaf make? But for that boy's eyes, it was everything. He checked his watch again. Meeting in 20 minutes, other side of downtown. He could ignore it. He could. But his hands were already pulling the overcoat closer. The cold air slapped his face as soon as he stepped outside. It was the kind of cold that chills even the bone, seeps through expensive clothes, grinds down your pride. Passing through the doorway, Eduardo drew in a deep breath, watching his breath drift away. The sky was dark, threatening rain. On the street, horns blared, people rushed, few noticing a graying man moving faster than usual. I'm just going to check, he tried convincing himself under his breath, flipping up his collar. He looked around, hunting for any sign of the boy. Nothing. Suddenly, a flash, a small figure darting across the wet sidewalk, dodging a laughing couple. There he was, bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, his old sweater puffed with fear and stolen bread. Eduardo picked up his pace, heart beating harder with every step, more urgent than any meeting anxiety. Impossible not to remember, even if he didn't want to, his own childhood, under that damp slab back in the hinterland, wanting to vanish every time his empty stomach hurt. Only now, it was different. He was the one in the expensive coat, chasing after a child. A strange reversal. The boy disappeared again, weaving through vendors, clutching the bread like a shield. Eduardo stumbled over his polished shoes, almost fell, looked around to see if anyone noticed. The cold tapped lightly at his face. Pollution mingled with the sweet smell of bakeries and a touch of bitter regret. The boy, so small among the grown men with shopping bags, seemed invisible to almost everyone. In the rush, Eduardo noticed strangest details, an old woman with a purple scarf clutching her coat tight, a guy blasting music through headphones with zero cares, a pigeon pecking at scraps by the gutter. But his eyes searched for that matted brown hair, those battered feet on the stones. Time seemed to slow, as if Eduardo's entire routine belonged to another life, that life of numbers, meetings, decisions that never involved barefoot kids. He was a bit angry with himself for caring so much, but he couldn't pull away. Every step swelled the doubt. What right did he have to intervene? Maybe he'd only frightened the boy more. But no explanation was enough to stop him. Before he realized, he was just a few meters behind, watching the boy pick up speed, glancing over his shoulder every so often, skittish, as if he'd spent a lifetime running. The city noises were loud, cars, horns, people griping about the weather, signs rattling in the wind. In the middle of it all, Eduardo heard only his own breath and a weird feeling, like an invisible wire pulling him forward. With every corner, he felt the ground get grimier, the walls more cracked, the air turning to yesterday's trash. His shoes and fancy watch seemed out of place, but the boy didn't care. His only focus was to disappear, as if the world would collapse if anyone got close. It was just 4 blocks from the ritzy bakery, but felt like another planet. Eduardo kept walking, scanning the narrow alleys, doors locked with rusty chains. He felt fear, yes, but also a growing sense of duty, as though he had no choice, as if turning away would be worse than any late meeting or reprimand. The cold grew sharper, Gus tossing old newspapers beside his shoulder. One more time, the boy dove down an alley between two buildings, wrapped in shadow. Eduardo stopped at the entrance, took a deep breath, catching the heavy smell of damp, dirty laundry, some wet dog in a distant corner. His hand trembled as he reached for the wall for support. He couldn't quite explain why, but he realized he had to understand what could drive a child to steal bread like that, without a second thought, or maybe, after too many thoughts. There, in that darkness, the silence was different, a hurt kind of silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. He thought of his own mother, her scoldings, the punishments he'd thought so unfair as a kid. He remembered times he'd vowed never to feel ashamed of himself again. And now, standing there, all he wanted was to know where the boy was headed, who could be waiting for him, what fear might be bigger than the one in that bakery. The rain had finally started. Heavy drops pelted Eduardo's shoulders, chilling him through the expensive leather of his coat. Still, he stepped inside. It wasn't impulse anymore, it was decisiveness. He'd promised to be strong for everything, but had never tried the kind of strength this required. The bakery door still swung behind him, but Eduardo already felt the clammy cold climbing up his legs. He gripped his suit jacket tight, his eyes locked on the distant figure, the thin silhouette cutting through filthy puddles. People shoved past. Well-dressed folks didn't even look. Only he kept after the boy, determined not to lose sight. The early rain still lingered over the streets. Droplets streamed down the curb, the smell of wet asphalt and old garbage mingling with a sweet perfume drifting from an upscale restaurant already opening. Eduardo slipped not once but twice. He shouldn't be here, he thought. 2 phones rang in his pockets, but he ignored them. It was as if everything else had gone silent, except the boy's desperate dash ahead. The boy darted across an avenue without even looking. Cars honked. Drivers swore, muffled by rolled-up windows. Eduardo's heart seized when he saw the kid almost taken out by a bus. But he vanished on the other side, just a shadow, his oversized sweater and filthy, bare feet. Eduardo took a deep breath and hurried after him, feeling his heavy blazer soak through. The city woke in its gray way, everything big, fast, and personal. But his eyes never left that boy. He was scared, yes, scared of where he was going. He'd walked down dark sidewalks before, but nothing like this. It hurt. The memory of being hungry, of his mother inventing stories about invisible feasts to fool his and his brother's empty bellies, all of it resurfaced without warning. He was embarrassed even to think of it now. Owner of 3 companies, expensive watch, but his hands shook. The boy slipped through a narrow alley, footsteps echoing on the wet cobblestone. Eduardo hesitated. The sharp stench of urine and old grime stung his nostrils. Inside, 2 men argued in low, gruff voices from behind crooked window frames. One glanced Eduardo's way, muttered under his breath, but went back to his cigarette. Eduardo didn't look back, just pressed on. The boy was farther ahead, dodging piles of garbage bags. A dog barked, loud, almost growling, making Eduardo jump out of his skin. The animal, wedged between crushed cans, wouldn't let anyone near. Not the boy. He slipped right by, unfazed, made a silencing gesture, and kept going. Eduardo realized how used to all this the child was, as if it were everyday life. And he wondered, how does a child this small become at home in this? With every turn, Eduardo felt the gap widen. The boy faded, then popped up again, darting into alleys that barely looked like they existed. They passed a group of teenagers in caps, joking loudly, tossing cans at each other. One of them looked at Eduardo's clean clothes and scoffed. "Lost something, rich boy," he shouted. Eduardo ignored him, didn't even blink. The smell of food dispersed, leaving only wet metal, rot, and cold. Eduardo's own feet were freezing. With every wind gust, he felt like quitting. His head ached. He thought of turning back, forgetting it all, just letting it go. But he couldn't get the boy's face out of his mind. Those scared eyes, running from the whole world. At one point, Eduardo stopped beneath a broken awning, took a deep breath, wiped sweat off his forehead. He tried to spot where the boy had gone. Spied the frail silhouette cutting across another alley, now nearly invisible in the murk. He was scared. Remembered his father, who'd hit them if anything ran short at home. Did this boy have a father like that? Or maybe not even that. At every step, the city sounds faded. The wealthy part of town, the glass towers and luxury cars, disappeared. Eduardo felt he'd crossed a border no one could see. This was another world, where comfort never arrived, where childhood meant nothing but survival. He started noticing things he'd never seen before. A child's nightgown drying on an iron fence, plastic bags plugging holes in a wall, a girl sitting on the ground fiddling with an adult's cast-off sandal. The boy vanished again. Eduardo sped up, knees aching. He realized he hadn't run for anything in years, only for money, only for obligations. Here, he ran for someone whose name he didn't even know. His heart pounded harder, a mixture of fear and an urge to do something better. And there, behind a rusty gate, Eduardo saw. The boy entered, head down, squeezing that old loaf so tight it could have been treasure. No one noticed him pass, just the dogs, just a parrot shouting from a windowsill. The businessman didn't know what he was looking for, but deep down, he couldn't turn back without knowing. The cold was worse in the alley shadows, the rain now just a drizzle. Eduardo stopped, leaned his back against a damp wall, closed his eyes for a second, tried to recall the last time he'd felt like crying, maybe as a child, maybe not even then. He opened his eyes and watched a while longer. No one there knew who he was, what he owned, all the important meetings hanging from his wristwatch. Just another strange man in the wrong place. In a flash, he understood. Maybe he was the one out of place. Because the boy, even on that filthy corner, walked like he knew where he was going. Eduardo looked again and felt a pang he'd never known. Not hunger, not cold, but something deeper. The silence was weighty there. Only the sound of Eduardo's ragged breathing. He decided to wait, perfectly still. Something in the way the boy hid that bread, glanced around so nervously, never blinking, pulled the rug from under him. And for the first time in so long, Eduardo simply felt. He had to see where this child was going. Eduardo stopped at the mouth of the alley. The stench of wet garbage hit him hard, the kind you feel all the way up your nose. He waited there, half-hidden, leaning against a peeling post. The streetlights didn't reach this far in. He could see only because of a sliver of light leaking from a high window. He wanted to shout the boy's name, but didn't even know it. The boy walked slowly, checking all around as if someone might still appear. Stopped beside a pile of cardboard boxes, tripping over his own feet in his rush. At every move, Eduardo felt his own heartbeat pick up. He didn't even know why. Just a boy stealing stale bread. But there was something here so different from anything he'd seen. Then the boy pulled it out from his sweater. The bread was small, hard, already had a bite taken out of it. For a split second, Eduardo thought the boy would just devour it there, still shivering with cold. But that's not what happened. The boy squatted in front of the boxes and whispered softly, "Anna, Caio, you can come out." Two little bodies emerged from behind the boxes. First, a little girl with tangled hair, grimy skin, eyes that knew too much sadness. Couldn't have been more than 4. Then, a baby. My God, a real baby, 8 months at most. The boy pulled the two closer, sheltering them with his body as best he could. He stayed like that for a moment, back turned to the street, as if wanting to hide them from the whole world. Eduardo remained rooted, barely breathing. He wished, somehow, he had a camera to capture it, not to judge from a distance, but to force anyone to actually feel it. The girl, Anna, looked at her brother like she was waiting for magic. He broke the bread in half, with the practiced calm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The pieces scattered on the dirty floor. Anna grabbed the biggest bit, smiled without showing her teeth, gazed at her brother with an adult's gratitude. Maybe Caio snatched his chunk in his little fist, but barely knew how to eat. He dribbled and strained, groaning faintly with each try. You could see the hunger in all three, the hollow gleam of kids who haven't eaten right in a long time. There was no joy, no talking. Only silence, a silence so heavy it could scream. Outside, cars honked, motorcycles revved, people ran. And there, only the crunch of teeth on stale bread, tears trapped in their throats, their breath quick and nervous, not wanting to be discovered. Eduardo took a step back, bumped his shoulder against the wall by accident. He waited for them to notice, but they didn't. They were too busy trying to survive. And for the first time in a very long while, he felt something in his chest. Anger, sorrow, and a strange guilt for not being able to do anything at that moment. The boy, he could hear his name now, Lucas, threw his arm around his sister, protected the baby with his legs like a shield. You couldn't tell who was the adult and who was the child right then. The three of them, sharing an old loaf on a wet, cold floor, had a kind of courage Eduardo never found in that luxurious office where he spent most of his days. His own childhood flashed into his mind, the straw mattress, cracked heels, the feeling of no one seeing you. He thought he'd forgotten, but he hadn't. The same pain came rushing back in those children's eyes. For a second, Eduardo wanted to leave. He turned toward the busier street, tried to control his breath. It's not my problem, he even thought. But his body wouldn't obey. He stood still, the cold slipping under his expensive clothes, heart beating like he'd been shocked. At the far edge of the alley, Lucas finished the bread, licking the crumbs from his sister's hand. With every gesture, he touched her gently, fussed with the makeshift blanket over the baby, pausing to sniff his forehead, making sure he was still breathing. Anyone could see there was love there, even mixed with fear and hunger. Anna leaned against her brother's shoulder, squeezed her dirty hand around his arm. "Thank you, Lou," she whispered. So soft Eduardo barely heard, but felt the gratitude deep in his bones. The floor was cold as metal. The sour mold mixed with stale urine and rain. In a corner, broken toys, fragments of plastic bottles, as if to distract the baby. No one looked up. Heads down, eyes wary, only the tiniest flicker of hope. Eduardo closed his eyes for a moment. Thought about how much money he wasted, how much bread went stale and untouched. He felt angry at the world, at adults, at himself. He wanted to scream, did anything not to witness this. He just didn't know what to say. All he knew now was that pretending none of this existed was no longer an option. So he stayed there a while, staring at that scene like an open wound, searching for the courage to get closer. Somewhere far off, drowned by the city's din, it was as if the whole world had disappeared. There was only that alley, 3 children, and a piece of bread they shared with such care. Lucas looked out at the street once more, eyes fierce, chin lifted, wary. The posture of someone who's lost everything more than once. And then, Eduardo understood, the children's secret wasn't just hunger. It was the strength it took to keep going, even when the world did everything in its power to make you give up. At first, Eduardo barely felt the cold. But standing there, in that damp alley, the chill seeped through his expensive suit, into his chest, into his bones. He looked at those children as if the world around them had changed color. Lucas, the bread thief, didn't even notice anyone was watching. He was too busy caring for the other 2, those little ones huddled beside him. The way he tore the bread, trying to make those scraps fit the hunger of 3 empty stomachs. He handed the biggest piece to Anna, who held it as if it might vanish at any second. Then, on instinct, Lucas patted his sister's head, a quick gesture, meaning it'll be okay, even when it so clearly wasn't. The baby, Kaio, looked so fragile. He gripped the bread with both hands and tried to gum it, barely managing. His lips quivered. He fussed and whimpered. Anna tried to help, pushing a crumb into her brother's mouth. Her big, dark eyes were heavy with exhaustion. She hardly seemed like a child. She didn't complain. She just watched, silent, waiting for the next instruction from her older brother. Eduardo felt something tight squeeze his chest. It was like what he saw shrank him from the inside. In his memory, flashes of the past, butchered pieces he always tried to bury. He remembered a worn-out mattress on hard-packed dirt, feet aching from the cold, his mother coughing on the other side of the curtain, being ashamed to ask for food. There, he saw the same furious loneliness he once knew. The same fear of grown-ups, the same silent slicing words before they could form. He lowers his gaze, embarrassed. He doesn't quite know why. He just knows he wishes he could be anyone but himself in that moment. He wishes he had easy answers, noble gestures, but all he feels is the urge to cry. His hand trembles a little. He shoves it into his pocket, tries to play it cool, stares at the distant cars, at the muffled noise that hardly reaches this forgotten corner of the city. Lucas, even with his small, wiry frame, straightens up to stand between his siblings and whoever else is nearby. He scans the sides, eyes hard, alert. His nose is running. He doesn't care. His hair is messy, his thin shirt stained all over. But it's his eyes that really catch the attention, a mix of defiance and fear, of someone who's already taken more beatings from life than any kid should. Eduardo takes a deep breath. The air smells of wet garbage, pooled rainwater, bread that's almost gone stale. He thinks of his own children, now grown, raised with everything money could buy. But he also remembers when he had nothing, when the future looked like a wall with no door. And he feels guilty for forgetting that as he got rich, for judging the boy at the counter as just another little thief, instead of seeing the desperation reflected in his eyes. Time doesn't seem to move here. All you can hear is a bus braking somewhere distant, a brief siren, the last drops of rain dripping from the roof tiles that barely cover this alley. No one passes by. No one sees these children, just like no one saw little Eduardo on the street, all dirty, waiting for someone to say, "Come with me." Lucas chews slowly, with almost no appetite. He looks at his bread, then at Anna, at the baby, eyes darting everywhere. He doesn't cry, he doesn't panic. But he doesn't smile or play, either. He's just a tiny warrior, exhausted, forced to grow up long before his time. Anna clutches her piece of bread in both hands, looking first at her hand, then at her brother, as if making sure she won't get hit for eating. Her hair sticks to her forehead, her knees are dirty and scraped. Still, she takes a deep breath before handing the last bit of bread to the baby. Such care, such small strength, it tugs at your heart. Eduardo is angry at himself, at the fact that this is so common, at all the people who ignore it, who cross the street, who look away. He wants to command the world to stop, to shout for help, but no sound comes out. What good would saying anything do? Him, so used to giving orders, to contracts and sums, now standing here, seeing 3 children invisible to the city's eyes. At that moment a sharp wind blows, and the baby shivers. Lucas pulls him close to his chest, shields him as best he can. That's it. This boy, so small, does the impossible to keep his siblings together, alive. Eduardo can hardly keep from crying. Something he never allows, not in front of his kids, not his wife. But here, the pain is bigger than his pride. For a second, Eduardo thinks about leaving, pretending he never saw anything. It would make everything easier, would be so much more comfortable. But his legs simply won't move. He remembers his mother whispering, years ago, never turn your back on someone who's cold, the way you once were. Just a memory, yet it feels suddenly raw and immediate. He realizes he has no authority here. His rich man's city means nothing in this place. No one is coming to save these 3. And it breaks his heart, almost physically. Time drags on. Lucas wipes his nose on his sleeve, watches Anna, covers the baby a little better. His eyes stop for a moment on Eduardo, who, from a distance, takes it all in. There's a brief spark, an almost invisible silent plea. It isn't the easy kind, not, help me, but more like, don't hurt us. Eduardo knows, somehow, this moment will mark him forever. The poverty, the silent pain, the frightened gaze, it all comes back like a slap in the face. It was supposed to be just another day. A bakery, overpriced bread, the usual hurry. Now it feels like years are weighing on his soul. 1 boy, 2 siblings, 3 fates tossed to chance. And worst of all, he knows that when he walks away, this scene will keep happening with or without him. The cold tightens. The sky darkens, and a light, constant drizzle begins to fall. Lucas shrinks in on himself. The siblings shiver, but don't complain. Silence settles over again. Eduardo understands. No one is coming here. If anything is going to change, it has to start with him. You know what hurts? It's looking at a kid like Lucas and realizing he doesn't even have the luxury of being a child. He just survives. And in that moment, Eduardo decides he won't push those memories away anymore. He won't pretend the past doesn't matter. Because here, in this alley, more than ever, he remembers little Eduardo, and he knows he has to be different. Even if he's afraid, even if he doesn't know how. The wind was bitter that morning, and the alley seemed even darker now that Eduardo had come closer. He stood for a moment across the street, watching. He didn't know what to say, or how anyone was supposed to act in a situation like this. In his world, everything made sense, everything was sorted out with words, papers, checks. But here, squeezed into this narrow space with soggy cartons for beds, the rules were different. He drew a breath, pulling in the cold air until it stung his chest. Before moving, he looked at Lucas again. The boy was sitting there with the stale bread in his hands, carefully dividing every crumb. His eyes, so small, were hard, wary, as though childhood had been thin on the ground and life's lessons too abundant. Anna, the little girl, pressed up against her brother, shivered in the morning chill. The baby, Kaio, swaddled in a blanket as thin as a napkin, gave a tiny cough between sighs. Eduardo stepped forward, his expensive shoes nearly sinking in the mud. He felt discomfort, not from the dirt, but from uncertainty. He almost apologized just for being there, interrupting a moment that seemed to belong only to silence. Hey, kids, his voice came out lower than he expected. The reaction was instant. Lucas jumped up, yanking Anna to him and shielding the baby with his own body. Eyes wide, far too wide for a child. He looked ready to bolt at Eduardo's slightest move. Eduardo quickly raised his hands, showing they were empty. Easy, easy. I don't want to hurt you. But Lucas didn't calm down. He was shaking from cold and fear. His face twisted with an expression that, just looking at it, hurt. A frown forced into ferocity, summoning courage he probably didn't even know existed. Anna clung to her brother's leg, half hidden. The baby woke up completely, starting a muffled cry beneath the cloth. The sound seemed to echo up and down the alley, as if everyone in the world could hear that pain. Eduardo felt his stomach knot. Part of him wanted to just act, to offer a solution, give everything these boys needed. But from the look in Lucas's eyes, he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Something deeper was broken. This boy had heard too many promises already. He tried a crooked smile, took a package of sweet bread from his bag, opened it slowly to show it was food, not a threat. He held a piece out toward the boy. See? It's real. It's clean. I bought it just now. For you. Lucas shrank back further, holding on it tighter. He stared at Eduardo, but his eyes betrayed his fear. They seemed to say, "Don't try to fool me. I've seen this act before." "I don't want it," Lucas muttered so softly only Eduardo heard. Another adult might have felt offended, might have left. But Eduardo stayed. He felt that rejection pierce his heart, digging up old memories from when he too trusted no one. He breathed again, feeling his throat tighten. "How long have you been out here?" he ventured. Lucas didn't reply, just kept glaring. His face was dirty, cheeks red from the cold, but his resistance was enormous. A sad strength, worn down by broken promises. A car rumbled by in the street, spraying a cloud of dust along the edge of the alley. The air turned heavy, tinged with gasoline. At times like this, Eduardo hated himself for not knowing the right words. He wanted to say he'd help, but didn't know how to prove it. Everything he owned seemed useless here. Glancing out the corner of his eye, he saw Anna reaching for a fallen scrap of stale bread. Her tiny hand, fingers icy. Before Lucas could scold her, Eduardo crouched, still speaking softly. "No need to be scared. I'm not here to take anyone away. I just wanted to feed Kaio." He nodded gently toward the baby. The baby's crying grew louder. Lucas looked, splitting his attention between the suspicious man and his little brother. His chest heaved with quick breaths. He glanced at Anna, then at Kaio, then at Eduardo, a silent standoff. "We don't need it," Lucas said, his voice rough, almost breaking from holding back tears. "Leave." A new line of raindrops began, drumming on the boxes and the filthy ground. Eduardo looked at the boy, and something clamped shut in his memory. Memories of his mother being scolded by a social worker, and him standing in the corner begging not to be taken from his family. Every hair on Eduardo bristled, yet he stayed in place. Gentle hands, but a set jaw, someone determined not to leave. For a moment, nothing but the drizzle. Its sound blending with distant traffic. The scent of stale bread, wet clothes, fear. It felt as if time had stopped entirely in that alleyway. Eduardo considered leaving the bread there and walking away. But that stare from Lucas, so full of wariness, came back to him. It wasn't just hunger for food. It was hunger for trust, for safety, need that couldn't be sated by a snack. He looked at the three of them, covered in dirt, and an overwhelming urge to protect them filled him up. How to explain that to them? He didn't know. But he wasn't going anywhere. The cold deepened. Eduardo slipped a hand into his coat pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and, almost without thinking, discreetly held it out to Anna, who coughed quietly. Still, he just stood there, awaiting any sign. Deep down, he knew this was only the first attempt, and it might be useless. But he couldn't give up. In this alley, every silence was an answer and a hope. Eduardo kneels, very slowly, lowering himself to the level of the three siblings. His briefcase tumbles over into the wet dirt, but he doesn't care. He only sees those eyes, so round and scared, as if they have no expectation of hearing anything good again. The drizzle falls in a rhythm that seems almost sad, louder when it hits the stacked cardboard boxes. Each drop a reminder of how cold and wrong everything is here. Lucas squeezes Anna tight with his skinny arm. The two of them are mashed together, so close he almost forgets to breathe. His eyes cut through Eduardo like a knife, but behind the anger, there's a fear that would make any adult question their own pain. He tries to swallow his tears and only squeezes the old bread harder, trying to hide it. Anna, much smaller, can't hold out. She sobs loudly, nose running. Her tangled hair clings to her forehead. She glances at Eduardo, then at her own dirty feet, unsure whether to cry harder or apologize. The baby, Kaio, curled in an almost see-through blanket, whimpers quietly, the kind of cry from those who already know that making a racket won't help. Just a moan, just yearning for a lap, longing for anything but the cold ground. Eduardo feels all of this sink into him, uninvited. He tries to smile, but it comes out twisted, shamed. He doesn't remember the expensive watch on his wrist anymore, nor the meeting he's about to miss. All that matters now is not frightening these kids even further. He speaks softly, almost in a whisper. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I promise." Lucas clenches his jaw, bites his lips. The tears are there, about to spill over, but he holds them back. He holds on to everything. The bread, his sister, his fear, even his hope. His eyes don't flinch. He stares at Eduardo as if trying to figure out, once and for all, if this man is just another liar. The ground is wet. Eduardo's pants are soaked, but he doesn't care. He crouches lower, almost down on one knee. Everything is spinning in his head. He smells the rain mixed with the strong odor of soggy clothes and dirt. Suddenly he's thinking of his own childhood, times when he too was afraid of those adults in suits, afraid of broken promises. The silence between them grows so heavy, it feels like nobody is breathing in that alley. Only the rain and the children's sniffles break the quiet. Eduardo looks deep into Lucas's eyes. He feels ashamed like he's never known. How can anyone let a child end up like this? He sees the grime, the cold, the wary gaze. Every bit of it screams for help, but Lucas doesn't utter a word. Anna cries again, trembling now. Instinctively, Eduardo pulls off his jacket, a bit awkward. He's never done anything like this before, doesn't even know how. He gently sets his folded jacket down next to Anna, letting her decide. He's scared of frightening them more. The baby stops crying for a second just to look, then goes back to his quiet whimper. Eduardo swallows hard. He agonizes over what to say. He longs to pull the children into his arms, but knows he can't. Every wrong move is another lost chance. Have you eaten anything today? He asks, quietly, his voice barely there. Lucas just gives a tiny shake of his head. No. He doesn't speak, doesn't want to give in. His hand trembles, but he never lets go of the bread. The smell of the old, soggy bread is almost bittersweet. Eduardo notices Lucas's thin, grimy hand gripping it like it's a real treasure. Eduardo feels everything inside: guilt, helplessness, rage at the world. He thinks of his mother, how she'd have done things differently, and wants to whisk these kids away to anywhere warm and safe. He sees the growing fear in Lucas's eyes. He knows he can't make empty promises. He breathes deep. You don't have to trust me today. I just don't want you to freeze. I'll come back. I promise. Lucas stares at him for an endless second. His eyes say it all. You promise like everyone else? Will you disappear like my mother did? Anna clings to her brother's shirt, lost, and the baby, not understanding but sensing the tension, starts crying louder. The rain falls a bit harder. It slides down Eduardo's face. He's lost all sense of dignity, soaked to the bone. Still kneeling, he lets out a long sigh. An old sadness rises up, one that nearly wrecks him, but with it comes a solid decision. He won't be a coward. He won't turn away. The silence holds as he, still on the ground, looks at each face in turn. He sees panic, hunger, but he also sees a tiny spark of will to live in Lucas's eyes. And he knows, even if the kids still doubt him, even if it takes time, he can't pretend nothing happened. He picks up his briefcase, but doesn't get up just yet. Before he leaves, he catches their gaze and whispers, just for Lucas, I know how to wait. The decision is made. Nothing in this world will stop him from coming back. Not rain, not fear, not old ghosts. As he leaves the alley, pants and soul sopping wet, Eduardo knows he'll never sleep the same again. The street was quieter than usual, only that thin sound of water running along the curb and the cold wind cutting through the children's damp clothes. Eduardo was still crouched, his knees aching from the pressure and the hard ground. But he didn't move. He just looked at Lucas, waiting for some sign of trust. Anna tried to dry her tears with her filthy sleeve, staring at the ground. Little Kaio, on her lap, made tiny baby noises, as if even the strength to cry had run out. That's when the heavy footsteps broke the silence. A man appeared at the alley's entrance. Thick hair, patchy beard, a strong smell of sweat mixed with alcohol. His face was that of someone who stored too much anger for too long. He didn't even look at Eduardo. He was fixed on little Lucas, voice so deep it felt like thunder crashing right there in front of everyone. Lucas, come here, boy. What are you doing here with this guy? Without waiting for an answer, the man yanked Lucas so hard the kid almost fell to his knees, lurching forward in front of his siblings. All the light in his eyes went out. Only fear remained, raw terror. And something twisted in Eduardo's chest, a knot of rage, as if something ancient was screaming inside him. Let go of me, uncle, Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. But the man only squeezed harder, shaking the boy. Anna shrank into herself, hugging the baby tight, trying to disappear inside her own skin. Her little eyes were trembling, and you could tell she'd seen this scene before. Kaio started wailing, his sharp cry piercing the silence and echoing up the alley. Eduardo stood up, slowly, his suit already stained, clinging to his soaked body. He tried to keep his voice level, but it came out harsh. Let the boy go. They've done nothing wrong. The man turned to him, laughing that nasty, mocking laugh. Who do you think you are, Huh, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. These kids are my family. Don't need some rich guy handing out lessons. Do your own business? He spat, practically growling the words. Eduardo saw Lucas was shaking so badly he could barely stand. The boy kept his eyes on the ground, biting his lip, trying not to cry. And for the first time, Eduardo realized that, beyond the hunger and the rain, there was another fear haunting these three, the terror of this man. Anna couldn't take it. She started bawling, loud, sobbing. "Don't take my brother," she begged, looking up at her uncle, but his eyes felt no pity. There was only the need to prove he was in charge, and an old resentment from someone who lives life like a fight. Their mother's welfare's coming, isn't it? So I look after them. Don't need anyone meddling in my life, you hear? Get lost, or I'll sue you, rich boy. That'd be good for me. Money's money. The man squeezed Lucas's arm even tighter, leaving his fingers imprinted in the boy's thin skin. Eduardo blanched. He didn't know what to do. Go after the man? Call the police? Mention he's an attorney? Someone important? Nothing seemed to work here, in this part of the city where no one cares about screams or promises of justice. Then a piece of Eduardo's own past slammed into his chest. He remembered his mother, nights hiding from his stepfather, the way he learned not to trust a soul. He felt ashamed for ever judging these kids, for thinking a loaf of bread would fix everything. You're not going to hurt them, Eduardo said, quietly, trying to sound firm but feeling his throat tighten. Let me help, please. They need care. The man just laughed, letting go of Lucas for a second, only to step protectively in front of the kids like a guard dog. Yeah, help, give me the money and I'll take care of it. You think these kids want a rich stranger? They're my family. You're not going to be their savior. Lucas cowered behind Anna, head down, shielding his face. Anna trembled so hard she nearly dropped the baby, but she kept holding Kaio, like a real mother, even though she was only 4. Eduardo's indignation surged, a flood after a storm. He stepped forward, staring the man in the eye, trying to stay calm, but his clenched fist in his pocket bottled every last drop of rage and sorrow. You don't know what they've been through. If you've got any heart, let me help, at least tonight. No one's got to get hurt. The uncle stood silent for a second, breathing heavily, staring at Eduardo as if he were an enemy. The silence was heavy, filled only by the babies crying and the rain tapping on the cardboard. You could feel the fear in the air, tangled up with the chill and the scent of wet clothes. Lucas glanced at Eduardo, just a second, sending him a silent plea. The look of someone who's lost everything already and can't believe in anyone anymore. The man moved as if to threaten. You'd better not show your face here again. Got it? Or you'll regret it, he warned with a finger in Eduardo's face, all menace and ugliness. Eduardo breathed deep. He didn't answer. He just stared back, locking eyes, needing to say, without words, that he was not giving up. Not this time. Not on these children. Inside, a swirl of fear, courage, and an ocean-sized sadness. A nearly uncontrollable urge to wrap all three up and carry them far away, to a place where no one could hurt them like this again. In the end, the uncle shoved Lucas toward the box, making sure everyone knew who was boss. Then he stormed out, swearing, glancing back to be sure Eduardo wouldn't interfere. The echo of his footsteps faded, and the alley was silent again. The kids stayed quiet, huddled together, only Anna's sniffling and Kaio's soft cries breaking the hush. Eduardo stood frozen, hands trembling, finally understanding just how much pain was here, feeling firsthand how cruel the world could be to those who most needed care. The drizzle thickened. The cold felt harsher. Eduardo didn't have a ready answer, but understood that faced with this threat, he couldn't just be a bystander. None of them was just a sad case. They were lives, small and fragile, depending on him if anything was going to change. And so, in that uneasy silence after the rage had passed, Eduardo made a decision deep in his chest. He had to get them out of there. Before it was too late. That night felt even darker than usual. The cold cut through everything, even Eduardo's expensive clothes. The rain was thin but relentless, dripping down his face and plastering Lucas's already tangled hair to his forehead. The city kept moving out there, but in that alley, time felt frozen. After the fight, after all the shouting and grabbing, Eduardo waited, tense, in his car. He watched the man from a distance, always alert, fist clenched. He saw when the uncle finally walked away, muttering curses, stumbling into the gutter. Only then did Eduardo allow himself to breathe. His heart was pounding, not from fear for himself, but for what those kids might face at that man's hands. In the back seat, Lucas gathered some rags and tried to settle Anna, who was shaking. She kept her eyes fixed on her brother. The baby was crying, one of those thin, piercing cries. The noise made Eduardo feel powerless. He knew he had to act. There was no time to debate or plan. It was now or never. With the rain falling faster, Eduardo jumped out, opened the alley door quietly. He whispered to Lucas, "Come on, quick, son, before he comes back." Lucas looked at him with those big, wary eyes. Eyes that had waited through too many empty promises. Eyes that, child though he was, already knew far too much. Even so, urgency won out. Lucas gave a minute gesture to Anna, grabbed her cold hand. When Eduardo bent down to pick up the baby, he realized how absurdly light he was. All skin and bone. The baby looked up at him, hiccuping tears, and for a moment Eduardo froze, a sense of such heavy responsibility it almost hurt. They hurried to the car in nervous silence, wet footsteps, Anna sliding on the old flip-flops. Eduardo opened the door quickly, making sure no one in the building saw. He knew now wasn't the time to attract attention. Everything needed to move fast. Once inside, the three kids' breathing filled the car with a sad scent of street, of rain. Eduardo threw his coat over Lucas's shoulders. He accepted it, but sat stiff in the seat, watching Eduardo out of the corner of his eye, looking ready to bolt at any second. The car rolled slowly away from the alley. The windshield wipers scraped frantically. Street lamps splashed a yellowish light, illuminating the older boy's face, yet fear allowed not the faintest glint. Anna rested her head on her brother's shoulder. She shivered so much, Eduardo saw her little teeth chatter. The baby kept crying, hungry, simply too tired for anything else. Inside the car, the silence was bigger than the engine's roar. The silence of those who can't relax, who can't trust yet that they've escaped their nightmare. Eduardo drove, gripping the wheel, his fingers turning numb with cold. Heavy footsteps inside his chest, a guilt he thought he'd buried long ago. That feeling of seeing himself, once again, in the same frailty, the same escape. The glass fogged up, and for a moment, Eduardo remembered a night from his childhood, alone, covered in newspapers, listening to cars pass by. He remembered his mother's words, so far away now. "We always think we can't take it, but we can, son." That memory made his voice nearly break when he asked, "Is everything okay back there?" No one answered right away. Only the baby's soft, tired cries. Lucas looked at him, raising his chin, trying to be brave. But in that instant, Eduardo saw. Lucas was just a child, who only wanted to protect his siblings, who only knew they needed to get away. The car moved forward, crossing through the avenues lit up by a city that seemed not to see anyone. People with umbrellas, windows glowing in pretty apartments, and there they were, running as if they didn't exist. Eduardo felt a wave of anger, first at the uncle, then at the whole world. What kind of justice let children go through this? They stopped at a red light. Eduardo took the chance to settle the baby, tried to warm him with his own hand. "Hang in there, little guy, we're almost there." Caio gripped Eduardo's finger with his tiny hand, so frail it was almost see-through. For a second, Eduardo felt hope, but also a weight, a duty heavier than any meeting or money. Lucas's eyes went wide as he realized they were getting farther and farther from home. He watched out the window, alert, as if he expected the uncle to appear any second, as if he needed to memorize the road back. Anna whispered softly, "Is it going to hurt, Lucas? Are we going to sleep in the cold again tonight?" Lucas closed her hand in both of his. He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles with such a protective gesture that Eduardo had to turn away, swallowing hard. Right then, he saw the big brother, but he also saw the scared boy, just as alone as his siblings. The shelter was far. They passed busy streets, the smell of fast food, the scent of rain, horns blaring somewhere. Each one holding tight to what little they had, Anna with a scrap of cloth, Lucas with nothing, Caio now had only Eduardo. When they reached the shelter street, Eduardo looked once more in the rearview mirror. He saw three pairs of eyes, one weary and hard, another exhausted and drained of color, and the baby's, desperate just to feel no pain. And in that moment, he swore he wouldn't let anyone hurt those children again, no matter what happened next. They stopped at the shelter door. Eduardo got out first and opened the back. Lucas hesitated, still not trusting this strange man in a suit. But he saw Eduardo's hand outstretched. And this time, just this once, he allowed himself to be led. In the fine rain, in the coldest part of the night, with his heart squeezed tight, Eduardo took them into the shelter. Every step the kids took was another step further from fear. But the fight was only just beginning. That night at the shelter felt never-ending. A simple roof, peeling walls, the smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with something old, half-hidden. The cold still clung to everyone's skin, even after the volunteer couple had arranged 3 blankets over the siblings. Anna curled up, wide-eyed, clutching her faded fabric doll to her chest. She had no idea how to behave in a place filled with strangers. Every noise made her cling even tighter to Lucas. Even struggling against sleep, the boy stayed firm, sitting by the mattress where his sister now lay. Kaya was burning up. The little one whimpered softly, with hollow eyes, hair stuck to his forehead from the fever. Eduardo stood in the corner of the dormitory, barely blinking. Guilt weighed on him, the pain of watching a child that small dazed by hunger and fear. He tried holding Kaio, rocking him gently, but the baby turned away and coughed weakly. The crying wasn't loud. It was small, wounded, the kind where you've lost even the strength to ask for anything. Lucas wasn't thinking of sleep. He protected his siblings as best he could, always keeping an eye on Eduardo, still wary, as if he might need to run again at any moment. The most painful thing to see were Lucas's eyes. It wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion, shame mixed with a deep, hidden longing to maybe, just maybe, believe, to be close to someone. But every little gesture, hugging the blanket to his chest, fixing the baby's diaper, even trying to smile to calm Anna, showed a boy trying to be father, brother, and grown-up all at once. A volunteer came by with cups of warm milk. Anna had never held one before, so she spilled some on her blanket. She apologized, so quietly it was almost inaudible. The way Lucas cleaned up what spilled and handed her the cup again, saying, "It's okay, we'll clean it later," was both subtle and heartbreaking. The baby, with no appetite, turned away. Eduardo saw it all and felt something break inside him. Holding his own cup, he had to look away as tears threatened. He thought of everything he had, everything he'd ever gone through. Why was it so hard to change someone else's fate? He wanted to help Anna take a bath. It took him 2 minutes to realize she'd never used a shower before. She stood there, staring at the drain, not wanting to undress, shivering with suspicion and shame. Eduardo and the helpful volunteer exchanged helpless looks. In the end, Lucas went in with Anna and explained it was safe, that hot water would feel good. The girl stepped in with her eyes squeezed shut, death gripping her brother's hand, jumping every time water touched her skin. Eduardo watched through the glass door and took a deep breath. It was just a bath, a thing most people never think twice about. But here, it seemed an impossible challenge. It was well into the night before the kids finally lay down. Kaio was even warmer than before, his tiny body damp with sweat. Lucas cradled the baby, rocked him, hummed little songs only he understood. Eduardo sat beside them on the hard mattress, the feeling of helplessness clinging to him. So much responsibility now, it felt suffocating. He glanced at the clock, at the window fogged by mist outside, and couldn't help thinking how exposed all the world's failures were. Now and again, Lucas dozed, but jerked awake at every sound, a door banging, someone coughing. He'd be straight up again. Anna bit her lips red with cold, poked Eduardo's arm without saying a word. More than once, Lucas's eyes met Eduardo's. They didn't speak, but everything was there, the wish to trust, and a fear bigger than anything. Fear of adults, of shelters, of the future. Eduardo got up and walked the shelter hall. He saw other mattresses, other families, mothers with small children, all in the same leaky boat as always, tired, hungry, waiting. The sound of rain on the roof was constant, marking the passage of anxiety. He remembered his own childhood, never having anywhere to run. How does a child survive so much? He went back to the mattress. Lucas was sitting with the baby in his lap, Anna lying on her side, hands together, dreaming of someplace safe. Eduardo stayed silent, watching the boy, seeing courage and fear blended in the same face. A courage that nobody should ever have had to find at that age. The night dragged on. Again and again, Eduardo checked Kaio's forehead, feeling it burn. He wanted to call for a doctor, wanted to cry, wanted to give back the childhood that had been stolen from these 3. But the past can't be changed. All he could do was promise himself he wouldn't abandon them again. Eduardo couldn't shut his eyes that night at the shelter. He listened to the kids breathe, counting the seconds until daylight. An empty stomach hurt less than guilt. And, deep down, there in the middle of insecurity, Lucas was holding his siblings so tightly it was as if he let go, the world would collapse for good. No one here was a millionaire. Just people trying to survive. It wasn't even daylight yet and already everything was upside down. The makeshift shelter felt colder than ever, every icy gust cutting through the thin blankets and straight into everyone's bones. Anna barely lifted her head, her eyes worn out, and Lucas, so tense, didn't speak a word. But it was Caio's low, hoarse, strange crying that made Eduardo realize just how serious it was. There wasn't time to think. The baby barely moved, reddish spots on his forehead, dry lips, hollow eyes. Eduardo gathered Caio in his arms as best he could and motioned for Anna to hold Lucas's hand. The boy looked more lost than ever, cheeks dirty, clutching the bag with all they owned. They hurried to the car in heavy silence, broken only by cars on the avenue and the growling of their empty stomachs. The public hospital was big, ugly, noisy. People coming and going. The smell of disinfectant and sweat. The line was already down the hall even though it was early. Eduardo took a deep breath and tried to look calm for the kids, though his hands shook a little as he fixed Caio in his arms. He got to the reception desk, tried to explain it was urgent, but the woman barely looked at them, just pointed to the end of the line, her face tired and blank. Lucas glanced back once, as if he wanted to run. Eduardo knelt, met his eyes, and whispered, "I promise I'll do everything I can. I won't let anything happen to your brother." Lucas didn't answer, but stayed, wide-eyed, clinging to Eduardo's leg. Time in that line felt cruel. Anna dozed off, sitting on the cold floor, her face nestled into Eduardo's jacket. Other parents muttered, maybe recognizing the man in the rumpled suit among them, or thinking it was a police or child services matter, who knew. The truth was, nobody was really seeing the children. Lucas toyed with the string of his hoodie, shrinking smaller with every second, curled up with fear. In Eduardo's arms, Caio gave a weak moan, the kind only someone who's nearly lost a little one understands. Eduardo felt his chest squeeze harder than ever. This was different than before, different from losing money, a contract, or even a night's sleep. This was real fear. What if they didn't get help in time? What if nobody believed them? Whenever another name was called from the desk, Eduardo felt his chance slipping away. At last, it was time to face the receptionist again. He explained more firmly this time. Lucas, nervous, shoved his tiny hands in empty pockets. Eduardo's anger bubbled up, not at these people, exactly, but at the system, everything that makes a child wait for help for hours. His hand hit the counter by accident. His voice came out loud. "My son's really sick. He's just a baby. Please." The woman looked up, sighed. "Sit over there. I'll call you." Eduardo nearly lost it, but held on. He looked at Caio, now just whimpering, limp in his arms. Anna coughed near Lucas, who only widened his eyes, thinking he'd get yelled at or taken away. Eduardo almost shouted, but lowered his head, ran his hands through his hair, searching for calm in his own touch. When they finally called Caio's name, it brought physical relief to Eduardo. His whole body relaxed. A doctor in a worn lab coat greeted them, asking questions, touching Caio gently, her face steady, but her eyes kind. Lucas watched her every move as if he might need to shield his brother with his body at any moment. Anna reached for Eduardo's finger, looking for a lap to crawl into like a frightened kitten. The doctor explained Caio was dehydrated, high fever, maybe an infection. He'd need fluids, tests, maybe to stay in the hospital. Eduardo didn't hesitate, agreed to everything, dug through his pockets for papers, answered questions about shots and illnesses and fever times as best he could. A stab of guilt. He should have known more. Been more. Gotten there sooner. The hospital hallway was white and cold. You heard beeping machines, someone crying somewhere, another coughing in another room. All Eduardo saw was Caio's face, his eyes rolling unfocused, his lips parting without strength. Lucas sat on a strange bench, his tiny body, clasped hands, in silent prayer. He looked like he was praying, but didn't dare ask for anything out loud, afraid to break the spell. Deep down, Eduardo wanted to say everything would be fine, but he didn't quite believe it yet. He squeezed Lucas's arm, awkward, but knowing the boy needed to feel that someone there wouldn't just disappear. Every time the doctor passed by, Eduardo asked for news. At one point, a nurse got annoyed, said he needed patience. He apologized, but didn't back down. He'd sleep right there if he had to. He wouldn't leave until Caio got better. Gradually, Lucas eyed him from the side, wondering at this stubborn man who didn't shout or let go of them. When they finally hooked up the Ford to the baby's delicate arm, the relief was mixed with pain. Just one tiny victory, but it felt monumental. Anna finally allowed herself to rest her head on Eduardo, nearly drifting off. Night fell without warning. The hospital's harsh lights made time feel frozen. Tired, Eduardo watched the sky darken through the window, thinking about luck, bad luck, all the twisted roads that had brought these kids to him, and how much it hurt, seeing them just as he'd once been himself, at the world's mercy, waiting for someone to say, "It's okay, I'm here." On Lucas's face, fear still lingered, But there was also a spark of hope, a tiny light. Deep inside, with the needle in the baby's arm and that girl fast asleep on his side, Eduardo realized he needed to be more than a millionaire here. He needed to be present. He needed to be strong. It wasn't enough to want to help. You had to fight for it. And there, in a hospital that smelled of everything and had hope for nothing, Eduardo decided he wasn't going to let these children down. Inside that little room, everything was discomfort, cold, and silence. It didn't even feel like a hospital, more like a forgotten waiting area with plastic chairs bolted together, bland yellowish neon lights, and a distant smell of disinfectant. Taxis, ambulances, children crying in the halls. The sounds of others came muffled from afar, but right where they were, there was just tiredness. In that silence, Lucas slept curled up, dirty feet tucked behind the bench, his hair flopped over his brow, face open in sleep, too exhausted to even scowl. Anna, beside him, her head lolled over, still holding Eduardo's arm without realizing it. She was dreaming of something. Her nose crinkled now and then, so slowly. Caio, finally sleeping, only calmed down after so much medicine, his little arm bandaged, a toy car someone had tucked into his lap to suit him. Eduardo watched the three, not sure what to do with his hands, his eyes, or his heart. He stood for a while, then sat as well. The weight was simply too much. Nobody saw, but he cried quietly. Not sobbing, just his eyes, always full, wet for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He watched Lucas sleeping, seeing traces of his own face there, of the past he always tried to leave behind but which came back at times like this, without warning. Suddenly, everything seemed just like what he'd lived through before. Chilly hallways lined with tiles, the smell of hospital, morning lines, moldy bread stuffed in a pocket, that sense that nobody would care if he disappeared. He remembered his mother, skinny and tired, with her distant stare, caring for him and his sister with what little they had. The times he'd fallen asleep sitting up, just like the children now, waiting for a doctor, for food, for a tiny miracle. The hole in his stomach was the same, so was the fear that things would be worse tomorrow, that nobody would come. All those years, Eduardo swore he'd never feel that again. That, once he grew up, he'd never go without. He never did again. A house with a fireplace, expensive food, an imported car in the driveway. But, looking at Lucas, Anna, and Caio inside that cold little room, he realized nothing had really separated the poor kid he'd been from the businessman he was now. Just a single stroke of bad luck, one sick mother, some accident, and the world turned upside down. He covered his face with his hands, checked the clock, but time didn't move. All that sense of security and important urgency faded. All that was left was the sight of those three, sleeping however they could, surviving however they could, no one watching over them, except him, now. And even so, he was afraid he wouldn't be enough. It was strange how even while dozing, Lucas clung to that old shirt, almost like someone hugging a secret. You ever seen a boy who seems older than his years, with a small face and eyes too heavy, like he already knows not to trust any promises? That's what Eduardo saw. Anna tried to smile once, before sleep, but she was too weak. And Caio, so tiny, lost in his own yawns. They had nobody, he realized. Nobody real. Outside, sirens and horns never stopped. Inside, just the soft sound of the children breathing. A baby cried in another room. Someone argued with a nurse down the hall. Here, not a sound. Eduardo felt an absurd urge to scoop Anna up, fix Lucas's hair, sketch out a whole new future for Caio. But right then, even moving felt terrifying. He was afraid to promise and fail. The memories kept coming back, sharp as knives. When he was small, his mom always said, "All we really own is what we can shelter. If you're strong, shelter someone else too, Edu." He carried that inside him, but had sworn never to get involved in anyone's life again. Only now, how could he turn his back? How could he go home, take a shower, pretend he hadn't seen all this? What would he do if they were his own kids? He watched each child's breath, noticed how Lucas's eyelashes were so long, how Anna let a little smile out even as she slept. Caio, so tiny, clinging to his grubby scrap of cloth. The edge of the cold stinging their shins, the damp air from the rain now falling outside, little mirror drops on the window. Every detail hurt. He wiped his face, brushed the tears away softly, embarrassed by the other adults there. But his chest just tightened more. Every time he tried to decide what to do, the answer was the same. He couldn't ignore it. Not this time. Not after what he'd seen, what those little eyes had wordlessly begged for, even if full of mistrust. He felt a deep fear not of money, not of legal fights, but of failing to be strong enough for them. He closed his eyes and thought of his mother again, singing softly to him, voice hoarse, hugging with skinny arms, whispering, "It'll pass, son. One day it'll pass." He looked at Lucas. He wanted to promise him it would pass too. He stayed there for minutes. Tom stood still. Something turned over and over inside him, a decision. He would not abandon these children. No matter how much it hurt, or how hard it got, or how much the world said it wasn't his problem. The fear was still there, making his palms sweat, but alongside it came a certainty he'd never felt before. Now they were his. It was dark out by the time everything was quiet. Eduardo's face had changed, now it showed pain, but also a huge, burning desire to fight. He didn't need to say it. He felt it. And for the first time, he realized, some things never truly pass, they just change shape. And sometimes, healing the past means choosing not to ignore a child's pain, even when that child's not your own. Winter dawned again with that heavy gray sky, making everything feel harder. The city seemed colder that day, maybe because Eduardo knew what was coming. He hadn't even had his coffee. He just stood there, watching the kids sleep on the borrowed shelter couch, each wrapped in a rough blanket. Anna snored softly, thumb in her mouth. Lucas, even in his sleep, frowned as if haunted by nightmares. Caio squirmed his little arms, sometimes even smiled in his sleep. Despite the cough that made his chest wheeze, he seemed far too little to carry so much fight. It was early, only the cars outside made noise, but Eduardo's heart was hammering. He already had the money for a good lawyer, to do things by the book. Even so, the system seemed set up to make things hard, you know? Papers to sign, requirements from every direction, home visits from wary social workers. And the gossip, oh, it blew through like a draft under the door. The shelter doorman said, "What if he just wants publicity?" A neighbor prodded, "Rich folks want to play hero, but kids just bring trouble." Even the aides, one, scrolling through her phone, didn't lift her head when talking to him. But the worst was the kid's uncle, who stood outside court, shirt unbuttoned, finger raised, shouting for everyone to hear, "This is all about money. He just wants their benefit. Show some respect. Those veins VE got my blood." Lucas heard every word. He shrank, shoulders hunched, clutching the tough bread they'd brought for breakfast. Eduardo tried to ignore it, but felt a mess of anger, guilt, and that old urge to run from everyone. When they were finally called for the hearing, the cold seemed worse still. You know those rooms with too much AC, freezing your soul? No luxury here, just old chairs, nicotine yellow walls, a crooked frame, the sound of the clock ticking too slow. The judge was a stern woman, glasses sliding down her nose, hair held up with a pencil. She looked at the papers, then at the three siblings sitting together, looking tinier than ever before her. Anna came in clutching Eduardo's pants leg, trembling, almost crying just from the strange smell of the courthouse. The uncle's lawyer spoke loudly, cited Eduardo's spotless record, insisted the children didn't even know the businessman, that blood ties mattered above all. Eduardo's lawyer tried to argue. He's been there for them since the bread incident, he's done everything, paid for doctors, clothes, all voluntarily. Lucas sat up straight, like someone had ordered him to. He stared at the floor, dirty fingers fidgeting with threads on the ripped seat. Eduardo, beside him, feigned calm, holding back from grabbing the boy's hand, just watching, waiting for a sign. The judge called for quiet. She sat for a moment, turning the pages slowly. Then she looked straight at Lucas and asked, "Would you like to live with your uncle? Or would you rather stay with Eduardo?" Total silence. The air got so heavy even Anna stopped sucking her thumb. Lucas didn't answer. He looked at Eduardo's shoes, then at his own dirty feet, then at the floor. His mouth moved without a sound. The caseworker tried to encourage him, but the boy didn't even blink. Eduardo felt what he'd felt as a child when he couldn't speak, that mix of pain and shame. The judge tried again, gentler. "It's all right, dear. Just tell me, who do you feel safer with?" Nothing. Lucas seemed to shrink even more. The uncle seized the chance and shouted from the back, "Speak up, boy. Tell them who you want. I'm your family." The others in the room sighed. They were running out of patience, as if children are always trouble. But suddenly, Anna stood and walked over to Eduardo. She didn't say a word, just grabbed his finger and squeezed hard, like a drowning person clings to a life ring. The baby, Caio, in the arms of a social worker, broke out crying, hungry, or maybe just scared. Eduardo felt the warmth of Anna's hand. Such a tiny gesture, but at that moment, it was worth more than any document. He looked at Lucas. The boy's eyes were brimming with tears that wouldn't fall. The silence hurt. Eduardo remembered the nights when silence was his only defense, There was a second, maybe two, when Eduardo and Lucas met each other's eyes. The boy hesitated. It was clear that he wanted to trust, but the world had already taught him not to. The most desperate thing was seeing that even there, even close to someone who wanted to protect him, Lucas still couldn't find easy shelter. You could see it, the fear of being rejected, the longing to help, knowing that only time would soften that wound. The judge, seeing Anna's gesture, took a deep breath. This wasn't just a case about paperwork. There were 3 small lives here, each hoping someone would sincerely take their hand. Eduardo met her gaze, a grown-up look, the kind you share when you already know what childhood pain feels like. He didn't ask for anything. He was simply there, completely present, waiting for the boy on the sidewalk. The tension was thick. Even the noise from the street seemed to pause. Outside, sirens wailed, people shouted. But inside, everything went still, the suffocating silence hanging between despair and hope. Eduardo felt his own childhood settle onto his shoulders again. He remembered the cold, the hunger, the way his voice used to disappear. It was as if the past was begging to be broken apart, but this time was different. Now there was a little girl holding tight to his finger. A small hope, beating quietly. In the front chair, Lucas took a deep breath. He didn't say a word that day, but Eduardo was sure. Someday, trust would come. Someday the silence would be more than just an absence. It would become the start of a conversation. And right then, in a courtroom that seemed like a place where things ended, a little girl gripped a big man's finger. And the whole world seemed to wait and see if a skinny, silent boy would find the courage, once more, to believe in someone. In that chilly courtroom, it felt like no one could breathe quite right. The high walls, full of echoes, made everything feel further away. The sound of shallow breaths, a few coughs, restless whispers, these were the only things you could hear. And in the middle of it all, there was Lucas, sitting in the big chair, legs swinging, not quite able to reach the floor. His hair a mess, his big brown eyes trying to look brave, but underneath there was nothing but fear. The judge, serious as ever, looked at Lucas over her glasses. Her pen tapped slowly on the desk, her hand never seemed to stop moving. She asked again if Lucas wanted to say anything. He lowered his gaze, biting his lip the way kids do when they're not sure if they can talk without crying. Anna sat beside him, cuddled in an assistant's lap, clutching an old stuffed toy someone had given her at the door. The baby, Kaio, slept curled up in the stroller, but gave a tiny cough, almost as if he knew this moment mattered for everyone there. The children's uncle, a strong man, clean-shaven with a crisp shirt, looked around as if already too tired to care. He didn't seem to feel the chill of the floor, or the weight of it all. He just let out an impatient sigh. Eduardo stood on the other side of the room, wringing his hands, fingers woven so tightly together they turned white, trying hard not to show what he was feeling. You could see on Eduardo's face that the memories were bubbling just beneath his skin. His eyes kept finding Lucas's, as if silently pleading, "Trust me." But there was fear in his gaze, insecurity, even a trace of old guilt mixed with an aching wish to just hug that boy, right there in front of everyone. The judge asked for a gesture. Not in so many words, but she wanted them to show what they really felt. Nobody moved. Time felt slow, dragging through the weighty silence. Only the steady tap of the pen and quiet breathing filled the room. Then suddenly, Anna, a shy little 4-year-old, reached out and took Eduardo's finger, as if to say she wanted to stay. Eduardo's mouth flickered into a small smile, surprised and just a little hopeful, because sometimes it's the children who find paths adults can't see. Lucas stayed quiet. His sweaty little hand gripped the edge of his shirt. His heart seemed to beat louder than anyone else's in the room. His eyes darted from his uncle to Eduardo to the judge to his sister. Then he fixed his gaze on Eduardo and kept it there. It was as if Lucas was trying to read this man's entire tale, everything he'd been through, everything that had happened, if any of it was true, if it was safe to let his guard down, even for a second. A few seconds passed. Or maybe minutes. It's impossible to know. When the silence is that heavy, time changes. And then, very slowly, Lucas reached out his hand. Thin fingers, dirty from too many days on the street, inched closer to Eduardo's waiting hand. They locked eyes. Lucas took a deep, deep breath, and finally placed his small hand against Eduardo's big one. There was no sound. No words. Just a little sigh that slipped out. Nobody could tell if it came from someone watching or from Eduardo himself. The businessman's eyes filled with tears. He didn't even try to hide it. It was the kind of crying that comes when you can't hold back anymore, when fear, promise, and the unhealed wound of childhood all pour out together. The uncle shifted uncomfortably in his chair but stayed silent. The judge set her pen aside. She looked at those two hands joined, at the lighter look in Lucas's face, and gave the smallest, nearly invisible smile. The baby, sensing the change, made a soft noise and opened his eyes, searching for his sister. No one needed a speech. That gesture said everything. After so many cold nights, so much abandonment and fear, now there was hope. It wasn't certainty, wasn't the kind of promise you see in movies, but it was a real chance. Maybe the first one ever. When the judge announced her decision, her voice was firm, but it had a different tone in it now, something softer, as if she knew these three kids had already taken enough from life. She made it clear, "You'll go home with Mr. Eduardo. You all have the right to start over." Anna smiled. It wasn't a wide, toothy grin, just a quiet, genuine smile, the kind that appears after being hidden away for too long. Eduardo, beside her, wiped his eyes, trying not to let anyone see. The assistant picked up the baby in her arms. The uncle stood up without looking at anyone, muttered under his breath, and left. When the door shut behind him, only that small group was left, huddled together, a little lost, not quite sure where relief began and fear ended. Eduardo looked at the three of them. He wanted to speak, but all he could do was take a deep breath and pull Lucas gently by the shoulders. Anna ran to Eduardo's legs, hugging him without asking. This time, Lucas didn't pull away. He rested his head on Eduardo's chest, not entirely sure what he was feeling, but there was something new, a light shining through exhausted eyes. The tears flowed freely. They weren't just sad tears. It was because, for the first time, there was someone there to share the weight, someone who truly saw them. A clerk brought the siblings' worn-out backpacks and handed them to Eduardo, who gripped them as if promising to never let go again. Outside the courthouse, the wind was cold. But in that moment, nobody cared. The world kept racing by, cars honking, sirens far away. For those three, all that mattered was the warmth of joined hands, the baby's scent nestled in someone's arms, a little girl's goofy smile, and the hope of a new beginning, even if it still came with fear. Night fell early. The patter of rain against the window sounded different in this house, as if each drop declared that, inside, everything was finally safe. Eduardo stood for a while at the bedroom door, nervous hands clenched, but with a silly smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know if he should go in or stay put. He just wanted to understand what it meant to be the one who cared now. The clock still read 8 o'clock, but the hush already felt like the middle of the night. Inside, the light was soft. In the middle of the big bed, Lucas, Anna, and little Caio barely moved, each in a new pair of pajamas Eduardo had rushed out to buy at the nearest store. Nothing matched, but every piece was clean, cozy, colorful. Anna tugged the pink sleeve down over her hand, not quite used to wearing fresh clothes, while her older brother stared at the ceiling, eyelids drooping, as if he still wasn't sure any of this was real. The littlest, Caio, was already asleep, turned on his side, fist tucked close to his mouth. He breathed deep, not the sleep of someone who's afraid to be woken, but of someone who, for the first time, felt completely safe. Anna sniffled quietly into her pillow, floating between sleep and a gentle cry. Lucas, fighting fatigue, could not bring himself to fully close his eyes, afraid everything would vanish by morning. Each time he shuffled under the blankets, he reached out, just to touch his sister's arm, or to check for the baby's soft, whistling laughter. Eduardo lingered at the door, feeling awkward. He'd never had kids. He didn't know if he should say something, ask if they were okay, or just close the door and let exhaustion take over. He walked quietly to an old armchair and sat, eyes fixed on the scene, those three small, fragile figures, now his responsibility. The cold outside no longer seeped into that room. He pulled his coat close, as if instinctively wanting to shield even himself from the flood of emotions. The rain picked up. Outside, the streets were empty, and the glow of streetlights rippled in puddles on the sidewalk. The distant hum of traffic faded into the rhythmic beat of raindrops on the window. Anna rolled over and, barely opening her eyes, reached out for her brother's hand. Lucas gave the blanket a light punch, as if telling himself that yes, they were together and things had changed. Eduardo stared at his own hands. They trembled a little. He felt proud, but also scared. Signing a piece of paper, hiring a lawyer, that was the easy part. But to be here, this night, listening to children breathe, smelling shampoo and the newness of their clothes, that was something else entirely. He closed his eyes for a second, remembering his own childhood, the nights he and his mother shared an old mattress, always scared of the morning. He remembered her face, tired eyes, sweetness even in the hardest times. For a second, he wanted to cry right there. But he held it in. He needed to be strong. Deep down, he was terrified he wouldn't measure up, that the children would wake and see he wasn't as good as he seemed. Afraid of letting them down. Afraid of failing again, the way he felt as a boy. The baby whimpered softly, but didn't wake. Anna pulled the covers up to her chin, quietly smiling, maybe dreaming of cotton candy. Lucas finally succumbed to sleep, too tired to resist any longer. And after a while, Eduardo saw it, a tiny smile on the sleeping boy's face. It wasn't that nervous grin he used to wear when he wanted to look tough. It was the kind of smile that only comes when a child genuinely feels safe. At that moment, Eduardo's heart melted in a way he had never felt before. A flood of tenderness, a pride that almost hurt. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, the silence had the warm weight of home. He rested his head against the chair. The lamp was nearly out. He imagined his mother walking in, her thin, steady frame sitting beside him, whispering gently, just as she'd done when he was a child. "It's just love, son. The rest we learn as we go." It felt real, much too real. Eduardo wept quietly, letting a foolish tear roll down, unashamed. What shocked him most was realizing how much he'd already changed inside. It wasn't just for the kids. Somehow, in caring for them, someone was caring for him, too. He took another quiet breath and looked at the three of them again. No empty promises, no certainty. Only the will to keep trying. Outside, the storm raged on. Thunder rattled the windows, but nobody woke. For the first time, those children weren't afraid of the noise. Eduardo stayed there, watching over their sleep until his own eyes grew heavy. And before drifting off, he glanced up at the ceiling, sending a silent thank you to his mother and to everything that had led these children to him. He knew the struggle wouldn't be over, but in that house, on that night, there was only peace. And finally, after so long, someone smiled in their sleep.